rules don't always go down very well. The idea that you can make houses more energy efficient is good for everybody else.
In many places around the world, wellness is the new currency.
It becomes about the occupant, not the house.
In Season 4 of Ecogradia, some of the best minds weighed in on two burning questions at the core of sustainable architecture.
How can design become a force of good?
And how do we heal and repair broken systems?
In Times Square, Snøhetta sought to repair the urban fabric.
Cars ruin everything that is dealing with true city life. What happens when you remove the cars?
The best public spaces are new vantage points.
This will have a positive effect on the inhabitants of New York. They see their own city in a new way.
Barclay and Crousse spoke of design as a way of repairing what is broken.
How can we take remembrance as an opportunity to see a better future? Let's heal the place first. Let's create an open space, a processional way of going through this building.
That allows different degrees of understanding. And at the end, you rediscover the ocean, the horizon, the peace.
Stuart Smith of Arup discussed signposts pointing to a low-carbon future.
I don't see another way of living on a planet with finite resources. Scarcity of resource drives circularity. We definitely need to change the way you can create environments which are inspiring, as opposed to very linear, new, throwaway culture. I think it's going to be one of the biggest changes we see in the next 10 years.
We have to make some major choices.
Welcome to Ecogradia, where we meet experts and practitioners at the front lines of sustainable architecture and urbanism. My name is Nirmal Krishnani. I'm a sustainable design strategist, author, and educator based in Singapore. Season 4 has been a breakout moment for Ecogradia. Two headliners opened the series: Danish star architect Pierre and Kjetil Thorsen, co-founder of the award-winning Norwegian firm Snøhetta, who both spoke of sustainability as a process in need of guiding principles. The sentiment was echoed by Sandra Barclay and Pierre Crousse from Peru, Brenda Samaya from India, Vo Trong Nia from Vietnam, and Tone Wheeler from Australia, all architects with bottom-up perspectives. Often what they shared seemed to align closely with prevalent views around the world on matters of sustainable design, and yet, at times, some distinctions emerge. This season, we also took a closer look at specific issues and areas of expertise with specialists with different vantage points. Stuart Smith, an engineer with Arup, currently based in Berlin, unpacked carbon and circularity with us. Leonard Ng, a landscape architect with Henning Larsen in Singapore, gave us a primer on vegetated walls and roofs. And Liz Minet broke down the strategy followed by Interface, the American flooring solutions company, to turn their carbon-neutral carpet into a reality. Season 4 covered quite a bit of ground, and so today we're looking back at some of the conversations we had by digging up a few talking points. The opportunity here, in juxtaposing what was relayed by different guests, is to tease out threads of connectivity to give us a fuller picture of where we stand at this juncture in time. Before we start, let me quickly remind you that you can get more out of this episode on our website at ecogradia.com, where you'll find curated images and notes that top up what's being discussed today. And if you like what you hear, please subscribe to this channel by hitting the black button below the screen. We start this episode looking back in time before looking to the future. How did the sustainability movement start? What were the driving arguments? And if environment has been on the agenda for some time, why hasn't it caught on in a bigger way? Tone Wheeler, the Australian architect and activist who I spoke with in episode 9, fills in the blanks.
Looking back through the lens of time, there have been a series of waves of how we've understood sustainability. And that first wave was the idea that moral encouragement will happen if you just demonstrate to the populace at large the value of a passive solar house, the value of relying on solar power and wind power and so on. They will automatically be converted to that idea. And they didn't. Although moral encouragement, which really lasts from, after the Second World War up until about 1980, it increases scientific knowledge. There's a huge number of papers and books and research buildings, and it raises awareness of the issue amongst a small coterie, but it has no lasting impact whatsoever. The rest of Australia is building houses for themselves, and they're starting to build what eventually becomes the property industry, not a housing industry.
Why do you think that is? I mean,
because I think the pressures of living trying to, as for most Australians, earn enough money to put the deposit down on the house and get a house, look after your children, raise a family, look after the grandparents when they're older, try and find a car and then a second car. All of those exigencies meant that you might believe that alternatives were good, but you didn't see that as being something that applied to you. So we had this thing called gig fee, which stands for green is good for everybody else. So the idea is that, I support green, I support sustainability, I support recycling and passive so on and so, but it just doesn't apply to me. My needs are different. And there's a key technological thing in there as well. We were talking about passive solar as if it was an energy issue. How could you lower your energy bills? Energy bills in Australia were ridiculously cheap. Electricity was cheap with coal-fired power. We had coal. We have, we one of the world's greatest coal mines. We also have gas, and we had natural gas and coal-based gas. So there was no way that you were going to win it on that.
Yes.
The second wave that starts is one where the government sees you've raised awareness, and you've raised awareness for politicians who suddenly start to see, well, there is an energy crisis in 1973 in the United States, which comes to Australia. And there are possibilities of the environment being destroyed. There are, people are starting to worry about the fact that the market gardens at the edges of the cities, which have provided us with such brilliant, fresh food all through the 70s and 80s, are starting to disappear. And food security becomes an issue. So we must do something about that. So the politicians start to regulate for it. Now, you have to understand the mindset of the Australian family in that rules don't always go down very well. It's a freewheeling society. The country is a Garden of Eden with these suburbs spreading out through it. And things are fairly easy. If you're told that you can't do something, there is a natural tendency in Australia to say, well, bugger you, Jack. We're going to do it. So very quickly, the idea that you could regulate to make houses more energy efficient falls on deaf ears. Australians don't take very kindly to the idea of regulation. And therefore, two things happened in parallel. One was to build a set of regulations that would control the quality of primarily suburban houses, because that's what we had. And the other one was to try and regulate that, but do it in a way in which it wasn't a clear-cut set of rules. Energy, the idea that energy would control things doesn't work. So by the early 2000s, 1/3 of Australian housing stock, which is all suburban houses mostly, doesn't have ceiling insulation. I think there's two things to understand about this. Firstly, that the government is doing more carrots than sticks. Sticks are not working, it's going to be carrots. And secondly, the housing stock is so poor, we've got so far to go. So the second wave fails, the regulation fails.
This is a pattern that is not unique to Australia, that the convergence of regulation and market-based tools like green certification or green building councils didn't provide that lift that everybody was talking about. That the business model, as it were, was somehow flawed, right?
And we've been talking about energy and materials for so long. We convinced ourselves that that's what sustainability was about. And we'd missed the fact that we were now looking at a social issue that was far more overwhelming, and the inequality. And that's paralleled in the United States and the United Kingdom. At the same time, the sustainability advocates moved to a third wave. And that is that you don't encourage people to do it. You don't say to people, you must do it, and this is the regulation. You simply disguise it by saying it's actually going to be good for you.
Right.
Do not use the word sustainable. Do not use the word green. Do not tell people that it's energy efficient or water efficient. Tell them that it's going to give them a better lifestyle.
Right.
That's an important point, because it becomes about wellness. It becomes about the occupant, not the house. And that's the dynamic change that happens in that third wave, is that you start to talk about what is occupancy rather than what the building is.
In the third wave, according to Tone, sustainability goes undercover. Wellness is the new currency. It used to be return on investment, but it is now comfort and health. This is an ongoing conversation in many places around the world, often beyond the scale of the standalone building. Kjetil Thorsen, co-founder of the Norwegian firm Snøhetta, talked about wellness at the scale of the city in our second episode this season. This is less about the efficiency of metropolitan networks and more about safety and the pleasure of the urban experience. He offered an example, a project from his firm that did just that.
It's definitely Times Square, because in New York, because it was so full of traffic, it was like overloaded completely. And you asked the question earlier, what needs to be in a public space? Well, what doesn't need to be there are cars. Because cars have a footprint that ruin everything that is dealing with true city life. They're only about driving and parking. And whatever they do, they take too much space. So when the cars were removed through Jan Gehld's first studies on the pedestrianization of Times Square, there was a clear indication that this would probably only have a positive effect on Times Square per se, and how it was used not only by tourists but also by the inhabitants of New York. And what happens then when you remove the cars? You locate a body in a position where before there were only cars. So you see your city in a new way. All of a sudden you're located in a place where you've never ever been in your city, except inside a car driving through. It's crazy, and we saw that. We were providing the benches and the public amenities that were there for people. They would get up on the benches and stand on the benches to have full view of this new position in the middle of Times Square, where before there were only cars and buses and whatever.
Right.
And it's crazy. They see the city, their own city, in a new way.
Yeah. The best public spaces are new vantage points for the city, aren't they?
Oh, yes.
But I think it's also remarkable what happened as a consequence of this pedestrianization. So just to recap, large swaths of area around 42nd and 47th Streets were pedestrianized. And so you basically doubled the amount of public space, got rid of the curbs, got rid of the clutter, introduced seating and benches and so on. And the removal of cars, according to the data, suggests that pedestrian injuries dropped by something like 40%. Accidents were reduced by 15%. The one that surprised me the most, and the first two are expected, but the third one was the crime rate decreased by 20%. I don't understand why crime would go down because cars are gone out, but that is...
it's actually less aggressive.
Less aggressive, right.
I would say, the way of hiding away, you have more public watching every square meter of Times Square. I wouldn't say public control, but it's definitely a way of reacting towards the atmosphere that is being generated there. And in addition to that, of course, pollution went down massively.
Right.
Air pollution. And the turnover for the shops went up.
Right.
So there wasn't really one measurable negative consequence. And the interesting thing was they did not even predict where these cars that were no longer able to drive along Times Square, where they would go. So they just blocked it. And the cars, it's like water. They found a way around. But nobody knew where they were going to go.
But there was an additional congestion in the area, on the surrounding areas.
And of course, impatience.
Right.
So there's always a knock-on effect somewhere, but not to the extent that Manhattan didn't work.
In Times Square in New York City, Kjetil and his team at Snøhetta sought to repair the urban fabric, to situate human experience at the heart of good design. And the question that led their design thinking was never just how to be sustainable. It was never about making something less bad. It was about making things good. Later in episode 3, Sandra, Barclay, and Jean-Pierre Crousse from the Peruvian firm Barclay & Crousse also spoke of design as a way of repairing what is broken. They too start by questioning how we see ourselves in our world. Their architecture is a way of being and knowing. Key to this are the stories that the buildings tell. There is another aspect of what you do, and I think many architects do, which is storytelling. And there is a project of yours I'd like to touch on, Place of Remembrance, because the storytelling has a very specific purpose, which is that of healing. And I know Peru had a very traumatic 2-decade history of political upheaval, and so this building was built as a recognition of, as a way of remembering this. Very basic question: what is the importance of remembrance in the work that you do in this project? Why is remembrance so important?
So I think the competition that was held was very important in a national scale. So it was the first building which was made to heal, okay? To heal from, as a society, from these 20 years that cost more than 70,000 deaths. And you know, the worst humanity can do. No? So we're dealing with intolerance. We're dealing with a lot of bad things. No. So how can we take remembrance as an opportunity and not as a burden, okay? As an opportunity to see a better future. And I think the message this building wanted to convey, not only by us architects, but by this commission that was created for doing that, was to look to move forward. So how can society heal and be not to forget, to heal remembering, okay? Because most societies in these traumatic periods of history, they try to heal by forgetting, and I think it's much deeper and much more difficult, but much more sustainable to heal remembering. Okay, so there was a very large social movement, because it's the only place of remembrance, of museum of memory that was in Latin America that has been done despite the government. So the government didn't want this place. Okay, and it was created by a commission that was created to tell the story of this intolerance, how it happened. No, in a normally very pacific society, the worst things, the most crude violence that we can imagine. And when we participated in this competition, the first thing we said is architecture cannot deal with this kind of memory, of the memory of pain, intolerance, on what we have as humans, the worst of us. We should try to take in account other memories, and try to bring them all together as a whole. And we started with the memory of the place, because it's in the border of the cliff that separates Lima, the Lima Plateau, from the sea, from the Pacific Ocean. It's like a 90-meter high cliff, composed by cliffs and ravines. The site was destroyed by the construction of a highway going down to the beaches, etc. So the first thing that we said, let's heal the place first. Let's build in the same logic as the cliffs. So make a building that is an artificial cliff, starting from that. So by doing that, we started to relate the building with a territorial system of cliffs and ravines that is long like 15 kilometers. So the building now seen from the bay is like one more piece of these thousands or hundreds of like cliffs that arrived to the sea. That was the first thing, and the second one was more about the craftsmanship of people who were going to build this place. No, so we didn't have much money. There was $4 million to build all the sites, not only the building but the site. We proposed something that wasn't in the brief, to create an open space, a platform for people to gather. We integrated a processional way of going through this building, which is one of the ways of healing. The procession is a way of healing, of communicating. If it's a religious procession, it's communicating with God, etc. This is a civic procession. And people working in this building should be put into light. Now, normally in a building, the construction workers are completely invisible. And we didn't want, in this case, these people to be invisible. We wanted to bring them to light, because they worked with their own hands, literally. Because we're still in a country where, in certain conditions, employing more people, more workers, is cheaper than putting a crane. And that was the case here. So we had people working, knowing that this was an important building for the country, for the society, and do it with pleasure, with nurturing the building, you know. So the imperfection of building by hand, and we planned all that on purpose. The forms of the concrete are handmade, are glued together. There's nothing industrial there, and so the imperfection of that building, because it's imperfect, because made by hand, was suddenly a way to draw a map. The building draws a map of what was the construction process, with all its defects, with all its little errors, and it summarized another memory, the memory of building.
Making it,
so
yeah.
we united the memory of the facts, violence that are exhibited inside with the memory of territory and place and the memory of construction. No? And that was our contribution to remembrance.
Sandra?
And I will say that concrete in that case helps a lot to integrate as layers as these cliffs, like in the same logic they were built, but also in creating this essential structure that will host spaces, that will host exhibitions or other activities like flexible activities, and that allows us to bring natural light, really not avoiding to be, because the position of the building was really in facing the ocean. Right. So it's very tempting. It was very tempting to do really openings to see the ocean from the. But we were seeking for an intimate experience that allows you to really focus on what you are able to understand, because there are different degrees of understanding in this parkour. And then it's only at the end of in this new public space that is on top in the roof, when you arrive to this space, that you are rediscovering, after you have seen, you rediscover the bay, the ocean, the horizon, the peace. So it was very important also to stay very essential in terms of space, light, finishings. So there's nothing added and little budget, but it also helps us to keep essential things. Focus on this experience that is going to help you to understand or heal. It depends. And I think concrete also helped us to achieve this experience. Yeah.
I sat down in episode 4 with Stuart Smith of Arup and discussed signposts pointing to a low-carbon future. He's an engineer who has spent a great deal of his career thinking about the ecosystem of the design construction industry at large. We delved into an important concept gaining traction today as a pathway to a sustainable tomorrow: circularity. Could you talk a little bit about what circularity is, why it matters, and in what specific ways it linked to the carbon question?
Yeah. So I'll give you a very simple definition of circularity, which has worked for me very well. And that is that it's about keeping materials and resources at their highest value for as long as possible. So it's a very simple concept, but when you unpack it, it becomes obviously quite complex in terms of how you apply it and how you think about it. Mm-hmm. And it's one of those things that can be a little bit misused. So it can be extracted into all sorts of other things. But for me, it's about that very simple concept. And in 2016, I really wanted to explore that and apply it to the built environment and see how it would work. So I launched a project called The Circular Building, which was part of the London Design Festival in September 2016, which explored the ideas. And I got together a team in Arup to work on this and asked them to take these principles and then see them through in a project. And it was really fascinating. You know, it was very difficult to change the mindset, first of all, to think and design in a different way. And what did it mean? One of the breakthroughs was really looking more deeply at the work of Stuart Brand, a researcher from San Francisco, not the only one, but developed the idea around shearing layers, the layers of a building.
Yes.
And he looked at how buildings learn, he called it, over time. He looked at change and what the issues were and what the problems were. And he determined that a lot of the problems were the rates of change between the different layers of the building. And so we took that diagram, the 6 S's, the layers diagram, and we used that as a very literal example of the building. And once we broke it down into layers, and then we thought, well, so we've got to think about each layer differently. We've got to design it for different perspectives and different timelines. It really opened up the way we were thinking about it. So it's a framework, and if we could put that into place, it would mean we would keep all of our materials in use, which would imply, if we collect good data, we have material passports. So basically, if we've designed something to be assembled in components, we've allowed for those different layers to have different timelines so we can take them apart, change them, adapt them over time, recover the materials. I think the other thing we see is that if we're using that approach, we can be much more specific about the materials we're using. So we can start to introduce more biomaterials into the supply chain for different components, and then think about where they go at the end of life. And also then another part of that is introducing materials as a service. So you're not owning the materials, but you're renting them. And for things like fit out, we talked earlier, 20% of the carbon, in embodied carbon is in the fit out materials. If you can have those, perhaps not necessarily own them, but have them supplied to you as a service, then you can take them all apart and give them back to the supplier, and they can remanufacture them into something else. And we've completely transformed the picture there. So there's some very easy things we can start to work at straight away whilst we figure out some of the bigger picture items.
I see circularity as being almost a rethink of the ecosystem in which we operate, right? So it's a city scale economy question of whether there are indeed companies that are willing to take the waste from one sector and turn it into a resource for somebody else. So this is beyond what the architect or the engineer does at the drawing board. But give me an example of a few things that we can do that really will at least begin the journey towards circularity.
Yeah, so I would advocate at the moment designing everything for disassembly so you can take it apart. I would advocate good digital data so that you can record what you put into a building. And that then allows you to have material passports, which can be as simple as QR coding materials and so on, so that you can track them and recover them. And one of the problems we have at the moment, you've got very little information about the materials you're recovering. So you perhaps have to test them and recertify them and so on. So trying to eliminate that problem. And then being able to create the ecosystem in a city that will take those materials back, and it's either they get the value of the materials gets retained because there's somebody who can take them and resell them, and the logistics of that obviously need to be figured out. But that's appearing in many cities with startups doing just that. So scaling those up, and then there's also materials that can then be returned to suppliers, and a lot of manufacturers and suppliers are now embracing this idea, but it's very difficult for them to have that reverse logistics if they've been set up in a different, with a different business model. We've found this in the circular building. The plan was that we would take components from the building industry, put them together, have the prototype there for 3 weeks, and then give all the materials back to the suppliers afterwards. But a number of the suppliers didn't want the materials back. They wanted to be part of the project, but they didn't know what to do with them. It was difficult for their process. That's got to change so that windows, facades, components of buildings can go back to manufacturers. Glass manufacturers have started to realise, without a supply of glass, that they're going to struggle in business, so they want to get the glass back now. But of course, so making things like that happen through the way we design and through the way we record and store the data, and eventually the way we contract and own materials. Fantastic thing about it as well is that there's so much employment in that, and that's the economy part of circular economy.
Right. I was going to ask about that because there seems to be an almost perverse logic working against it. And to just contextualize what I mean is that I had a microwave that had one part broken.
Yeah.
And it was 5 years old, and I called up the supplier and I said, hey, can you replace the part? And they said, oh, we'll give you a discount on a new one. And I said, I don't want a new one. Can you just replace the one part? So we're dealing with an economic system that's working towards designed obsolescence. That's a well understood kind of idea that the more you throw away, the more you consume, the stronger the economy. I know this goes beyond the ambit of what architects and engineers do at the drawing board, but it does affect how, as you say, the relationship that we have with suppliers and manufacturers, which is how do you get them to how do you revalue these issues and construct an economy around valuing resources rather than consumption?
Yeah. Well, some of these things are happening anyway because there obviously is value in secondary materials, and as material prices go up and material becomes scarce, there's more value in it. So some of it's happening anyway. But in places like, for example, Amsterdam, where they're really actively supporting and encouraging and nurturing a circular economy, so they're helping businesses get started, providing a lot more support to the ecosystem to get it going, then of course it's starting to take off, and they're also able then to start to measure things like how many jobs they've got in the circular economy, and that's started to creep up. So where you've got a city that's supporting it, and that tends to be places like Amsterdam, some of the Scandinavian cities have started to really embrace the concepts. I'm sure that in a lot of other European cities it's going to appear. I think the concept will just grow and grow, because I don't see another way of living on a planet with finite resources. So you'll see a lot more of it.
You mentioned cities in Europe, but I'm wondering, what does circularity look like, say, in a city in Africa or in Indonesia? What is the face of it there?
Well, a lot of it will be about looking at what resources are there already and making best use of those, and actually to some extent that scarcity of resource drives circularity. So if there's a waste resource, there's a very interesting lecture at the Norman Foster Foundation around circularity of waste plastics in Cairo. And actually, if the municipality steps in and interferes with that, then of course lots of jobs get lost, because that's people collecting up plastics and making a living from it. So to some extent, those waste streams are already precious and valued. And if we could make sure that the systems develop to facilitate circularity, so we're not trying to retrofit it in reverse, which is what we're trying to do in Europe. Then maybe we start off in the right way as we start to grow and develop some of these cities. That would be my hope. There's a big challenge there. We definitely need to change attitudes slowly about existing and used and reused materials and buildings. I mentioned earlier the work of Lacaton and Vassal, who've really transformed the way some architects and architecture look at existing buildings and shown what you can do, and the way you can create environments which are inspiring, and the value that we attach to those as well, as opposed to a very linear new throwaway culture. That's really going to change. I think it's going to be one of the biggest changes we see in the next 10 years.
I think so.
I think
too.
circularity is here to stay.
Right. No,
in 2016, my colleagues were looking sideways at me saying, "What are you doing?"
What do they say now?
Well, I think everybody's embracing it. It's as simple as that. It's in a way. I love what Alejandro Aravena says. He says, basically in the end, it's common sense.
Right. Yes.
If we've got a finite planet and it's just common sense. We're going to run out of it if we use it a lot. And I don't need to know much more than that.
Circularity is predicated on evidence and logic. Much of what we decide at the drawing board, or for our industry, says Stuart, should boil down to clarity of thought and purpose. But sometimes the choices we make aren't a simple matter of good versus bad. Sometimes things are more complicated. I want to end this episode with something Kjetil Thorsen reminded me of, that in the end, design is about making judgments, and this means accepting the trade-offs and sensing what fundamentally matters. In this situation, as of now. I was struck by something you said, which seems like an oxymoron. It's not bad against good. It's good against good.
Yes.
What does that mean?
It's one of the typical dilemmas, let's say. One example would be downtown Oslo, and a beautiful street there called Bygdøy Allé. The environmentalists wanted to chop down all the chestnut trees in order to create bicycle roads. Right? You know. How do you react to that? Okay, you get 50,000 more people to ride bicycles instead of cars, but you chop down hundreds of trees to get there, to make that happen. Now, I don't know which choice is right. Both have good intentions. And that's the type of dilemmas we are confronted with all the time. Here, again, back to Europe and Norway, with the wind turbines. We do know that huge 200-meter tall wind turbines have an effect on nature. We do know that the roads they're building in order to get to these wind turbines is ruining very vulnerable landscapes. But we also know that these turbines are producing clean energy. And we don't really know the embodied energy of a wind turbine. It's never really been gone through and calculated 100%. So we don't know yet how much energy some of these turbines have to produce in order for them to pay back even their own footprint. So these are the dilemmas.
Right.
And there is no obvious solution to it. It's very, very complex, very complicated. Food production worldwide, I think we're in the middle of we have to make some major choices, maybe even to the extent that we cannot solve everything at the same time. This podcast that we're having right now has a pretty big CO2 footprint.
Right.
Okay, maybe the message is important, so it's worthwhile. So if you look at our new webpage, you can choose how big a footprint you want to leave when you're using our webpage. And you can, at the bottom of it, also get into a calculation program to see how big your footprint on our webpage was. There is about 2 tons of raw material going into a laptop. And the funny thing is we need the laptop, we need the computers in order to calculate what to do with climate change.
This is the good versus good problem.
It is the good versus good. It is the dilemma.
If you enjoyed today's conversation, please click the subscribe button on this page to know first when a new video is out on our channel. It means the world to us and helps us reach out to more experts and practitioners with ideas and solutions on how to make this world, buildings and cities, more sustainable, one blueprint at a time. Thanks everyone. Until we meet next, this is Nirmal Krishnani signing off in Singapore.